Dearest listeners, there exists no torment quite so exquisite as the regret born of choosing safety over passion, particularly when that choice proves as hollow as a gambler's promise. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most heart-rending tale of Miss Diana Hartwell, who traded love for security and discovered 8 years hence that she had bartered away her very soul. As we embark on this journey together, I entreat you to show your favor for such tales of the heart with a man like Namway, and do subscribe to ensure you are present for every chronicle we share. Indeed, I should be most keen to read your own reflections in the Mori comments. Has your own life ever presented such an impossible choice? But let us not rush through this story of mistakes and redemption, for a tale of such delicate sorrow, much like a long hidden letter, must be unfolded with the greatest of care. The spring of 1820 found Miss Diana Hartwell in circumstances that would have seemed impossible to the radiant girl she had been 8 years prior. At 8 and 20, she occupied that peculiar position in society reserved for gentlewomen fallen upon hard times, companion and governess to her distant cousin, Mrs. Lucinda Fairmont, in that lady's grand establishment on Berkeley Square. The irony of her situation was not lost upon Diana, for Berkeley Square represented precisely the world she might have inhabited had fate, or rather, had she herself, chosen differently. Diana rose each morning at 6:30, well before the household stirred, to attend to her duties. She supervised the morning lessons for Mrs. Fairmont's 3 daughters, managed the household accounts with meticulous precision, and served as her cousin's amanuensis for the endless stream of correspondence required by a lady of standing. Her position was neither servant nor family, but rather that uncomfortable middle ground where one must maintain the appearance of gentility whilst performing the duties of employment. Yet those who observed Miss Hartwell closely, and there were few who did, would have noted something remarkable in her bearing. 8 years of reduced circumstances had not broken her spirit, but rather refined it, much as pressure transforms coal into diamond. Her features, once merely pretty, now held a story. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes, born not of laughter, but of long concentration over account books, and a firmness to her mouth that spoke of disappointments, swallowed without complaint. Her beauty had not faded, but had been reforged into something more formidable: character. Her gray eyes, which had sparkled with youthful joy in better days, now held depths of understanding that no protected debutante could possess. The golden hair that had once been dressed elaborately for balls was now simply arranged beneath modest caps, yet the severe style only served to emphasize the elegant bone structure of her face. Diana's father, the late Viscount Hartwell, had possessed the unfortunate combination of aristocratic pride and catastrophic judgment in matters of finance. Upon his death when Diana was 19, it was discovered that the estate was mortgaged to the hilt. The family jewels had been sold years prior, and debts stretched across London like a web of shame. Diana's mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving her to be raised by her father and his widowed sister, Lady Margaret Ashfield. It was Lady Margaret who had taken control of the situation with the ruthless practicality that characterized her nature. Diana would marry, and marry well. Not for love, certainly not for the foolish attachment she had formed to that wholly unsuitable young man, but for the preservation of what remained of the family's honor and solvency. Mr. Owen Garrett had been the wholly unsuitable young man in question. The son of a respected but decidedly middle-class architect, Owen had possessed nothing but his brilliant mind, capable hands, and a heart full of dreams when Diana had met him at a subscription ball in Bath during her father's final illness. Her father, growing desperate for distraction from his failing health and finances, had removed to Bath for the waters, and it was there that Diana had encountered Owen. He had not been invited to the ball, not properly. He had accompanied his father, who was consulting on renovations to the assembly rooms, and had somehow found his way into the gathering. Diana had been standing near the windows, escaping the oppressive heat of the ballroom, when a young man with ink-stained fingers and observant dark eyes had spoken to her about the architectural features of the room with such passion that she had forgotten entirely about propriety. Owen Garrett had been 24 then, lean as a whippet, with dark hair that refused to stay properly arranged and hands that sketched designs on any available surface. There was a restless energy about him, a focused intensity that society might deem bold, but which Diana found immediately captivating. He had looked at buildings the way poets looked at sunsets, and he had looked at Diana as though she were the most exquisite architecture he had ever encountered. Their courtship, if such an irregular thing could be called that, had consisted of stolen conversations at lending libraries, chance encounters in Sydney Gardens, and one perfect afternoon when her father's illness had required her aunt's attendance, and Diana had walked, quite improperly, with Owen through the countryside beyond the city. He had shown her his drawings that day, spreading them carefully on a sun-warmed stone wall. Grand houses that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, public buildings that married classical proportions with innovative design, bridges that appeared to defy gravity itself. His hands had moved over the papers with reverent care, and when he had looked up at her, his eyes had held such hope, such certainty in their shared future, that Diana's heart had felt too large for her chest. Owen had spoken of going to London, of establishing himself, of the commissions he was certain would come. He had taken her hands, propriety forgotten, and promised that within 2 years he would have the means to offer for her properly. 2 years seemed an eternity to Diana at 20, but it had also seemed possible, achievable, a future she could grasp. Then her father had died. Lady Margaret had descended upon Bath like an avenging angel, taken stock of the catastrophic finances, and laid the situation before Diana with brutal clarity. The house would be lost, the servants would be dismissed. Diana herself would be reduced to seeking employment as a governess unless she made an advantageous match immediately. And there was such a match available. Mr. Josiah Thornley, a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in the wool trade, was seeking to establish himself in society. He was 50, twice widowed, possessed of a considerable fortune, and willing to pay handsomely for the connection to a viscountess's daughter. He would clear the estate's debts, provide a modest income for Lady Margaret, and give Diana a position of comfort and security. Diana had resisted. She had argued, wept, even threatened to run away, but Lady Margaret had been relentless. This was not about Diana's happiness, but about duty, family, responsibility. Young Mr. Garrett, charming as he might be, could offer nothing. He was the son of a tradesman, barely a gentleman, with nothing but prospects as insubstantial as morning mist. Love, Lady Margaret had declared with cold certainty, was a luxury for those who could afford it, and Diana most decidedly could not. For 3 weeks, Diana had held firm. Then Lady Margaret had revealed the final, crushing truth. The debts were worse than initially thought. Without Thornley's intervention, Lord Hartwell's creditors would bring such ruin upon her father's name that bailiffs would seize what little remained, and their family would be barred from society forever. The shame would be absolute, the destitution complete. Every door in society would close, not just to Diana, but to all her relations. Lady Margaret herself would be reduced to seeking charity from distant connections who would offer it grudgingly, if at all. Diana had sought Owen out one final time. They had met in the pump room, surrounded by invalids and social climbers, with no possibility of privacy. She had rehearsed her speech for hours, trying to find words that would make the impossible bearable. In the end, she had been cruel because she had believed cruelty would be kindest. She had told him that she had been amusing herself, that she had never seriously considered a future with someone of his station, that she had been foolish to allow their acquaintance to continue as long as it had. The look in his eyes had haunted her every day since. Not anger, which she might have borne, but comprehension followed swiftly by devastation. Owen Garrett had understood immediately that something had happened, that she was lying, but he had also possessed too much pride to beg or plead. He had simply looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as though memorizing it, then bowed with perfect correctness and walked away. Diana had never seen him again. She had learned, through channels she had no business pursuing, that he had departed England within a month, taking a position with the East India Company's architectural division. The marriage to Thornley had been arranged swiftly, but Diana had discovered reserves of stubbornness she had not known she possessed. She had delayed, invented obstacles, developed convenient illnesses. For 6 months, she had held Thornley at bay while Lady Margaret had grown increasingly frantic. Then Thornley himself had resolved the situation by dying of an apoplexy while inspecting his warehouses. The debts remained, now without prospect of solution. The estate had been sold to satisfy creditors. Lady Margaret had retreated to live with a sister in Scotland. And Diana, with no dowry, no prospects, and no willingness to entrap another wealthy unfortunate, had accepted her cousin Lucinda's grudging offer of employment. That had been nearly 8 years ago. In the interim, Diana had learned to find satisfaction in small things. A particularly apt phrase in a letter, the pride of a student mastering a difficult piece of music, the precise balance of a well-managed household account. She had learned to live with regret as a constant companion, as familiar and uncomfortable as a stone in one's shoe. She had thought herself resigned to her circumstances, had believed that the sharp edges of her sorrow had been worn smooth by time. She had been utterly mistaken. The morning that would overturn Diana's carefully constructed composure began unremarkably. Mrs. Fairmont had been in particularly good spirits at breakfast, chattering about the upcoming renovations to the house. The building, though grand, had been constructed 60 years prior and had begun to show its age in troubling ways. Cracks had appeared in the drawing room ceiling. The kitchens were inadequate for entertaining on the scale Mrs. Fairmont envisioned, and Mr. Fairmont had expressed concern over structural groans in the servants' wing, which the original architect had constructed with more haste than care. The fashionable world was embracing newer, more elegant architectural styles that made the current interiors seem hopelessly outdated. Mr. Fairmont, who indulged his wife's every whim, had agreed to a comprehensive renovation. They had engaged Mrs. Fairmont announced with considerable pride, one of the most sought-after architects in London. He had recently returned from years abroad, where he had designed magnificent buildings for colonial administrators and wealthy merchants. His work was being praised in all the best circles, and he had been reluctant to take on domestic projects, but the Fairmonts' connection to several prominent families had secured his agreement. Diana had listened with the polite attention expected of her position, her mind already turning to the disruption such renovations would cause to the household routine. She would need to coordinate the protection of furnishings, arrange for rooms to be cleared in sequence, and manage the inevitable chaos of workmen throughout the house. It would be tedious, but she had managed far more challenging situations. Mrs. Fairmont's eldest daughter, Miss Sarah Fairmont, had expressed particular interest in the architect. At 22, Sarah was a diamond of the first water. Beautiful, accomplished, and possessed of a fortune that made her one of the season's most desirable catches. She had received multiple offers but had accepted none, claiming that she had not yet met a gentleman who truly captured her interest. The architect, Mrs. Fairmont noted with knowing approval, was young, handsome, unmarried, and had recently acquired a considerable fortune. Sarah had dimpled prettily at this information. Diana had felt a strange premonition then, an unease she could not name. She had dismissed it as simple apprehension about the coming disruption to the household. The architect was to arrive that very morning for an initial consultation. Mrs. Fairmont had insisted that Diana be present to take notes, as the plans would affect household management significantly. Diana had dressed with her usual modest care in a gray morning gown that reflected her position, arranged her hair simply, and descended to the drawing room where Mrs. Fairmont and Sarah awaited the visitor. The butler announced him precisely at 10 o'clock. Mr. Owen Garrett. Diana's entire world had stopped. She had remained frozen in her seat by the window, her notebook and pencil held in suddenly nerveless fingers as Owen Garrett walked into the room. 8 years had transformed him as surely as they had transformed her. The lean young man with ink-stained fingers had become a figure of considerable presence. He stood perhaps an inch over 6 feet. His frame had filled out with the assurance of maturity, and he dressed with understated elegance that spoke of both wealth and taste. His dark hair, still inclined to unruliness, was cut fashionably short. His face had lost the softness of youth, the angles now sharp and definite, and his dark eyes held a keenness that suggested he observed everything and forgot nothing. He had been greeting Mrs. Fairmont with perfect courtesy when his gaze had swept the room and found Diana. For the space of 3 heartbeats, his expression had been utterly unguarded. Diana had seen shock, recognition, and something else, something too quickly masked to identify. Then his features had assumed a polite neutrality so complete it had felt like a physical blow. Mrs. Fairmont had been oblivious to the silent drama. She had introduced Diana merely as her cousin and companion, who would be taking notes on the consultation. Owen had bowed with the correct degree of courtesy for her position and said nothing at all. And the consultation had lasted 2 hours that felt like an eternity compressed into minutes. Owen had produced drawings, explained concepts, discussed structural requirements and aesthetic principles with the Fairmonts. Diana had taken notes mechanically, her hand moving across the page, whilst her mind tried desperately to process the impossible reality of his presence. His voice had changed, deepened with maturity, and acquired an assurance that spoke of years spent commanding workmen and negotiating with powerful clients. He spoke of grand projects in Calcutta and Madras, of innovative techniques he had learned from local builders, of materials and methods that would allow him to create something extraordinary for the Fairmont residents. Mrs. Fairmont had been charmed. Sarah had been fascinated, leaning forward with flattering attention, asking intelligent questions that made Owen smile with genuine appreciation. Diana had watched Sarah flirt with Owen, had observed him respond with perfect courtesy tinged with evident admiration, and had felt something she had thought long dead stir within her chest. Jealousy, she recognized with bitter self-awareness, sharp and unexpected as a knife between the ribs. When the consultation had concluded, Owen had gathered his papers with brisk efficiency. Mrs. Fairmont had invited him to dinner the following week, an invitation he had accepted with apparent pleasure. He had bowed to the ladies and departed without his eyes once meeting Diana's directly. Diana had excused herself immediately, citing correspondence that required attention, and had retreated to her small room on the 3rd floor. There, in privacy, she had permitted herself the luxury of sitting perfectly still whilst her mind raced in chaotic circles. Owen was here. Owen, whom she had treated with such cruelty. Owen, who had every right to despise her. Owen, who had clearly achieved the success he had dreamed of, and who had returned to London society as eligible and desirable as she had once warned him he could never be. And she must now see him regularly, must supervise the renovations he would direct, must watch as he courted Sarah Fairmont, who was everything Diana had once been promised she would be. Wealthy, beautiful, secure in her position, able to choose love because she had the luxury of not needing to choose security. The following weeks had established a pattern of unique agony constructed from polite greetings and unspoken history. Owen arrived 3 mornings each week to supervise the work. Diana was required to be present, to coordinate access to various rooms, to manage the household around the disruption, to make decisions about minor details that Mrs. Fairmont could not be bothered with. This meant hours in Owen's proximity, watching him work with the focused intensity she remembered, observing the respect his workmen showed him, noting the brilliant innovations he introduced to the renovation. He treated her with absolute correctness. He addressed her as Miss Hartwell in a tone of polite neutrality. He consulted her about practical matters with perfect professionalism. He never, not once, referenced their past acquaintance. The complete absence of acknowledgement was somehow worse than anger would have been. It suggested that their history meant so little to him that it did not warrant even the smallest recognition. Diana found herself noticing details she had no business observing. The way his hands, still capable and graceful, moved over drawings with the same reverent care she remembered. The slight furrow between his brows when he encountered an unexpected structural challenge. The patience with which he explained complex concepts to workmen who lacked his education. The animation in his expression when he described a particularly elegant solution to a design problem. She noticed, too, that he wore no rings, that his conversation contained no references to family awaiting him, that he seemed to live entirely for his work with an intensity that suggested he had found his purpose and needed nothing else. Sarah Fairmont, meanwhile, had become increasingly determined in her pursuit. She found reasons to be present during Owen's visits, dressed in her most flattering morning gowns, asked questions designed to prolong his stay, and invited him to various social engagements with a frequency that bordered on impropriety. Owen accepted many of these invitations, a smile he consciously summoned, reminding himself that this was what a sensible man did: appreciate a suitable lady and put the ghosts of the past to rest. Diana heard about them afterwards. Owen at the opera, where he had explained the architectural features of the King's Theatre with evident knowledge. Owen at a soirée where his conversation had been praised as both intelligent and entertaining. Owen at a subscription ball where he had danced twice with Sarah, the maximum propriety permitted. Diana told herself that she was pleased for him, that he deserved happiness with someone who could offer him both affection and social position, that Sarah was genuinely sweet-natured despite her privilege, and would likely make him an excellent wife. She told herself these things repeatedly and believed none of them. The renovation progressed with impressive efficiency. Owen proved to be as skilled at managing projects as he was at designing them. Rooms were completed on schedule, the quality of workmanship was exceptional, and the transformation of the house was genuinely remarkable. He was creating something beautiful from something merely adequate, and Diana found herself watching this transformation with an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with architecture. 3 months into the project, the incident occurred that would crack the careful facade they had both maintained. Diana had been reviewing household accounts in the small study off the kitchen when she had heard shouting from the construction area. One of the workmen had made an error in supporting a wall section during demolition, and part of the second-floor ceiling had collapsed into the room below. Most of the workers had been at their midday meal, but 2 young apprentices had been inside the room. Diana had not paused to think. She had gathered her skirts and run toward the disaster, arriving simultaneously with Owen, who had been reviewing plans in the library. The doorway was partially blocked by fallen timbers and plaster. Dust hung thick in the air, and from within came the frightened cries of trapped boys. Owen had immediately begun issuing orders to the workmen who came running, directing them to secure the remaining structure before attempting rescue. Diana had pushed past him, slipping through a gap in the debris too small for the men. She had heard Owen shout her name, heard the anger and fear in his voice, but she had been focused entirely on the apprentices. One had been pinned beneath a heavy beam, the other crouched beside him in terrified paralysis. Diana had assessed the situation with the same practical clarity she brought to household management. She had directed the uninjured boy to help her lever the beam, using a fallen timber as a fulcrum, whilst Owen and his men worked to clear the entrance enough for extraction. The beam had been heavier than she had anticipated. Diana had felt something in her shoulder protest sharply, but she had ignored it, pushing until the trapped boy was free and could crawl toward the enlarged opening. Only then had she permitted herself to acknowledge the pain, the exhaustion, the way her hands were bleeding from splinters and torn nails. Owen had been there when she emerged, covered in dust and plaster, her gray gown ruined, her cap lost somewhere in the debris. He had looked at her with an expression she could not decipher, then had turned away abruptly to attend to the injured apprentices. The boys had been shaken but not seriously harmed, thanks largely to Diana's swift action. Mrs. Fairmont had been horrified when she learned of the incident, scolding Diana for taking such a risk while simultaneously praising her courage. Sarah had been impressed, declaring Diana quite heroic. Owen had said nothing at all. The incident had altered something in the careful dynamic between Diana and Owen, though neither acknowledged it openly. He became, if possible, even more formal in his interactions with her, as though by maintaining absolute professional distance, he could counteract whatever he had felt when he had seen her risk herself for his apprentices. Diana, meanwhile, had been forced to acknowledge to herself what she had been denying for months. She loved Owen Garrett still, not with the bright, uncomplicated passion of her 20-year-old self, but with something deeper and more painful. The love of someone who understood exactly what she had thrown away and could never reclaim. The understanding did nothing to ease her circumstances. Indeed, it made them considerably more difficult. She must continue to see him regularly, must watch Sarah's courtship progress, must smile and make polite conversation whilst her heart fractured anew each time. The social season was reaching its height, and the Fairmont household was in a constant state of activity. There were breakfasts, evening parties, expeditions to Vauxhall Gardens and the opera, and the endless round of morning calls that consumed the ton. Sarah was at the center of it all, and increasingly, Owen was present as her favored companion. Diana learned through the household gossip that the ton had accepted Owen with remarkable speed. His colonial fortune, his talents, and his connection to the Fairmont family had opened doors that would have remained closed to the ambitious young architect's son she had known. He was invited to Almack's, that bastion of social exclusivity, and had apparently acquitted himself admirably. Diana overheard the snippets of conversation. Lady Jersey had remarked on his unflinching gaze, unusual in a man of such modest origins, and Brummel, the arbiter of all things, had apparently approved the cut of his coat with a single nod. He was not merely being accepted. He was becoming an object of interest. He was, in short, everything she had once told him he could never be. The irony was not lost on Diana. Had she possessed faith, had she waited those 2 years he had requested, this could have been their triumph together. Instead, she observed it from behind the invisible wall that separated paid companions from their employers' social equals. Not that Owen would have wanted her even had circumstances been different. He had made his indifference abundantly clear. The young man who had once looked at her as though she held his heart in her hands was gone, replaced by this contained, successful gentleman who treated her with the same polite courtesy he extended to the housekeeper. 5 months into the renovation, Mrs. Fairmont hosted a significant dinner party to show off the completed portions of the house. Owen had been invited as both architect and, increasingly obviously, as Sarah's prospective suitor. Diana had been required to attend, as she often was when additional ladies were needed to balance the table, and Mrs. Fairmont did not wish to include anyone who might outshine her daughter. Diana had dressed in her best evening gown, a modest creation in dove-gray silk that had been fashionable 4 years prior and showed every indication of its age. She had no jewelry save her mother's pearl earrings, which she wore with a defiance she barely understood. The dinner had been a torture of proximity. Diana had been seated too far from Owen to converse directly, but positioned where she could observe him clearly. He had been seated beside Sarah, who looked radiant in rose silk with diamonds at her throat, and the two had talked with evident enjoyment throughout the meal. Sarah had touched his arm with practiced coquetry. Owen had smiled at her with warm appreciation. Diana had made appropriate conversation with the elderly gentleman on her right, had picked at her food without tasting it, and had felt every variety of fool for allowing herself to hope, even momentarily, that Owen might have retained any feeling for her beyond, perhaps, a justified contempt. After dinner, there had been music. Sarah had played the pianoforte with accomplished skill, then had begged Owen to turn pages for her. He had obliged, standing close enough that his shadow fell across the music, and Diana had watched them together and understood with crystalline clarity that this was how it would end. Owen would offer for Sarah, Sarah would accept, and Diana would attend their wedding in her capacity as companion and would smile and wish them joy while something inside her withered entirely. The evening had concluded with small groups forming for conversation. Diana had been seated with several other ladies, half listening to gossip about the season's scandals, when she had become aware of Owen standing near the window behind her, deep in conversation with Mr. Fairmont and another gentleman about the economics of colonial development. His voice had carried clearly, and Diana had found herself attending more to his words than to the conversation around her. He had spoken of India with knowledge and something that might have been affection, describing the challenges of building in that climate, the innovations required, the satisfaction of creating structures that would endure. He had mentioned, casually, that he had found the work fulfilling, but had been glad to return to England to apply what he had learned in his homeland. One of the ladies near Diana had commented, deliberately loud enough to be overheard, that Mr. Garrett seemed quite the eligible bachelor, and that Miss Fairmont was to be congratulated on securing his attention so thoroughly. There had been a pause in the masculine conversation behind Diana, brief but noticeable. Then Owen had resumed speaking, his tone unchanged, discussing timber imports with Mr. Fairmont. Diana had excused herself shortly afterwards, pleading fatigue. She had retreated to her room and had sat at her small window, looking out over the garden, acknowledging to herself that she must find a way to endure what was coming. Owen would marry Sarah. Diana would remain in this household, watching their happiness, and she would survive it because she had no choice. She had survived her father's death, the loss of her home, the reduction to employment. She would survive this too. She would become adept at not feeling, at maintaining a pleasant facade, at living within the narrow confines permitted to impoverished gentlewomen. It was what she deserved, after all. She had made her choice 8 years ago, and choices, she had learned, carried consequences that time did not erase. Summer arrived, bringing with it the traditional exodus of the ton to country estates and seaside resorts. The Fairmonts owned a charming property in Kent, and Mrs. Fairmont had decided that the family would remove there for several weeks whilst the final, most disruptive portions of the renovation were completed. Owen would remain in London to supervise the work, visiting Kent periodically to review progress with Mr. Fairmont. Diana had allowed herself to feel relief at the prospect of separation. Distance, she had reasoned, would provide respite from the constant ache of Owen's presence. She would have weeks without seeing him, without watching him court Sarah, without comparing what was to what might have been. Fate, however, appeared to take particular pleasure in thwarting Diana's modest hopes for peace. The day before the planned departure, Sarah had developed a severe throat infection accompanied by high fever. The physician had been adamant. She must not be moved. The fever had to resolve completely before any travel could be contemplated, and even then she would require several days of recuperation before undertaking a journey to Kent. Mrs. Fairmont had been distraught. She had social commitments in Kent, had been planning entertainments, had invited guests. She could not simply cancel everything. After much wringing of hands and consultation with her husband, a solution had been reached. Mrs. Fairmont and her younger daughters would proceed to Kent as planned. Mr. Fairmont would follow in a week once his business affairs were settled. Sarah would remain in London under the care of Diana and a skeleton household staff until she was well enough to travel. Diana had received this news with outward equanimity and inward despair. She would be responsible for Sarah's care and comfort, which meant she would be present whenever Owen called to review the renovation progress. There would be no escape, no respite, only more of the same agony of proximity and distance. For the first week, Sarah's illness had provided a buffer. Owen had called twice, had been informed that Miss Fairmont was indisposed, had conducted his business efficiently with Diana and the household staff, and had departed without incident. Diana had dared to hope that the situation might prove manageable after all. Then Sarah had recovered. The fever had broken, her energy had returned, and she had been starved for company after days of enforced isolation. When Owen had called to review plans for the final renovations, Sarah had insisted on receiving him despite Diana's gentle suggestion that she conserve her strength. The meeting had taken place in the morning room, which had been completed early in the renovation, and showcased Owen's talents admirably. He had transformed what had been a dark, cluttered space into something light and elegant, with windows that caught the morning sun and proportions that satisfied the eye. Sarah had been effusive in her praise, and Owen had accepted her compliments with modest pleasure. Diana had sat quietly in her customary corner, notebook in hand, whilst Owen explained the final phase of work. Then Sarah, with the thoughtless cruelty of someone who had never known real hardship, had asked Owen to tell her about India. He had obliged, describing the architecture he had studied, the challenges he had overcome, the satisfaction of building something enduring in a difficult environment. His eyes had become distant with memory, and his voice had held a note of something that might have been melancholy. Sarah had then asked, with apparent innocence, whether he had gone to India to seek his fortune or simply for the adventure. There had been a pause, barely perceptible. Owen's eyes had flicked to Diana for the first time that morning, held for a heartbeat, then returned to Sarah. He had gone, he explained with careful neutrality, because England had held nothing for him at the time. He had needed to establish himself professionally and financially, and the opportunities in the colonies had been substantial. It had proved to be an excellent decision, as he had gained both wealth and experience that now served him well. Sarah had sighed romantically, declaring it all very adventurous and admirable. Had there been, she asked with the directness permitted to beautiful young women, a lady who had inspired his ambition? Diana had stopped breathing. Owen had been very still. When he spoke, his voice had been devoid of inflection. There had been someone, he acknowledged, many years ago. But that had been a youthful attachment, long past, of no consequence now. Of no consequence. The words had struck Diana with physical force. Sarah had pressed on, oblivious to the tension in the room. And was he now seeking a wife, now that he had returned to England with such success? Owen had responded with perfect propriety that he was indeed hoping to establish a household, should he find a lady willing to accept him. Sarah had dimpled. Diana had felt ill. The conversation had continued along these lines, Sarah flirting with determined charm, Owen responding with apparent appreciation, Diana sitting in her corner, feeling as though she were slowly being suffocated. When Owen had finally taken his leave, Sarah had turned to Diana with triumphant excitement. Was Mr. Garrett not remarkably handsome and accomplished? Did Diana not think he would make an excellent husband? Sarah was nearly certain he would offer for her before the summer ended, and was not that wonderfully romantic? Diana had managed to produce appropriate responses whilst dying inside. She had escaped as soon as possible to attend to household matters, seeking refuge in the mundane tasks that had become her armor against feeling. She had been reviewing linen inventories in the still room when Owen had found her. Diana had looked up from her accounts to find him standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. He had apologized for disturbing her, had said he had forgotten to mention a detail about the kitchen renovations that required her attention. Diana had risen, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled slightly, and had waited for him to explain. But Owen had made no move to discuss kitchens. Instead, he had remained standing in the doorway, looking at her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of their isolation in this back portion of the house. The silence had stretched between them, laden with everything that could not be said. Finally, Owen had spoken, his voice low and rough. He had observed, he said, that she seemed to have weathered the years with remarkable fortitude. He hoped that her circumstances were satisfactory, that she was not unhappy. The concern in his voice had been unbearable. Diana had wanted to weep, to confess everything, to beg forgiveness she had no right to request. Instead, she had responded with the same careful neutrality he employed, assuring him that she was quite content, that her position with the Fairmonts was comfortable, that she had no complaints. Another silence. Owen seemed on the verge of speaking, his jaw tightened, and for an instant his hand clenched into a fist at his side before he forced it to relax. The internal battle was brief, but fierce. He simply nodded and departed, the supposed detail about kitchen renovations never mentioned. Diana had stood alone in the still room for a long time afterwards, staring at nothing, understanding that whatever fragile control she had maintained over her feelings was rapidly disintegrating. In August arrived with oppressive heat and the promise of storms. London in high summer was not pleasant for those who remained, whilst the ton fled to cooler climes. The city seemed to simmer with a restless energy that matched Diana's own inner turbulence. The renovation was nearing completion. Another month, Owen had estimated, and the work would be finished. He would collect his final payment, move on to other projects, and presumably formalize his courtship of Sarah Fairmont. The prospect loomed before Diana like an execution date. Mr. Fairmont had returned to London to attend to pressing business matters, and Sarah had insisted on remaining with him rather than retreating to Kent, citing her desire to see the completed renovations. Diana suspected the girl's true motivation was to maintain proximity to Owen during the critical final weeks of their courtship. The morning of August 15th dawned gray and threatening. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture and electricity. Diana had woken with a sense of unease she could not name, a premonition that the day would bring change of some kind. Owen had arrived early with a full crew, determined to complete the structural modifications to the servants' wing before the threatened storm arrived. The work was complex, involving the removal of several supporting walls and their replacement with iron beams that would create a more efficient workflow. It was dangerous work that required careful coordination and skilled labor. Diana had been in the main house, working with the housekeeper to plan the restoration of furniture to newly completed rooms, when the storm had struck with startling suddenness. One moment the sky had been merely dark, the next it had opened with torrential rain, accompanied by winds that rattled windows and tore at trees. The sound had come perhaps 15 minutes after the storm began, a terrible crash from the direction of the servants' wing, followed by shouts of alarm. Diana had dropped her lists and run, lifting her skirts and racing through corridors towards the commotion, the housekeeper following with surprising speed for a woman of her years. The work was taking place on the ground floor, but the removal of a key supporting wall, perhaps weakened by the storm's vibrations, had caused an irrevocable failure. A section of the floor above, the ceiling of the work area, had collapsed, bringing down tons of plaster, timber, and debris. The iron beam being installed had twisted under the unexpected stress and had fallen at an angle that had triggered a cascading failure of the temporary supports. Owen had been shouting orders, his voice cutting through the panic with commanding authority. Most of the workmen had escaped, but 3 remained trapped in the wreckage: 2 apprentices and an older craftsman named Wilson, who had been securing the far wall. Smoke had begun to rise from one corner where a fallen lamp had ignited sawdust and timber. Diana had assessed the situation with the same clarity that had served her during years of managing crises both large and small. The fire had to be controlled immediately, or the entire wing would be lost. The trapped men had to be extracted before smoke overcame them, and the remaining structure had to be stabilized before attempting any rescue lest the rest of the ceiling collapse. She had turned to the housekeeper and issued rapid instructions. Fetch every bucket and basin in the house, form a water line from the kitchen pump, send a footman for the fire brigade, though they would likely arrive too late to matter. Then, while Owen and his foreman were organizing the structural stabilization, Diana had stripped off her outer gown to move more freely and had begun organizing the fire suppression effort. The household staff had responded with admirable efficiency. Within minutes, a line of servants was passing buckets of water hand to hand, focusing on containing the fire, whilst Owen and his men worked desperately to shore up the weakened structure enough to attempt rescue. The smoke had grown thicker, and Diana could hear Wilson coughing from somewhere within the wreckage. Owen had created a narrow passage through the debris, propping it with timbers as he went, and had disappeared into the smoke-filled chaos. Diana had watched him vanish with her heart in her throat, understanding that if the structure failed now, he would die with the men he was trying to save. Minutes had felt like hours. Then Owen had emerged, dragging one of the apprentices, the boy unconscious but breathing. He had passed the youth to waiting hands and had immediately turned back into the wreckage. Diana had been at the head of the waterline, passing buckets with mechanical efficiency whilst her entire being was focused on the dark opening where Owen had disappeared. He had brought out the second apprentice, this one conscious and terrified. Then he had gone back for Wilson. This time, the delay had been longer. Diana had heard ominous cracking sounds from within the damaged structure. The foreman had shouted a warning, had tried to physically prevent Owen from proceeding deeper, but Owen had shaken him off and pressed forward. Then, amidst the chaos, she heard a sound that chilled her blood. The high, groaning shriek of a primary support beam giving way, the very sound she had heard faintly in the servants' wing weeks before. She did not think of the trapped men, or the danger or propriety. She thought only of Owen in there and the impossibility of losing him a second time. Diana did not make a conscious decision. She simply found herself moving, grabbing a wet cloth from the bucket line, pressing it to her face and following Owen into the wreckage. The world had become smoke and darkness and the terrifying sound of straining timbers. Diana had called Owen's name, had heard his response from somewhere ahead and to the right. She had followed the sound, crawling through spaces barely large enough to accommodate her, feeling her way through debris, the wet cloth pressed to her nose and mouth, barely filtering the choking smoke. She had found him with Wilson. The older man had been pinned by a fallen beam across his legs. Owen had been trying to lever it alone, but the angle was wrong and his strength insufficient. He had looked up at Diana's arrival with an expression of fury and terror combined. He had shouted at her to get out, had cursed her foolishness in following him, had continued struggling with the beam even as he berated her. Diana had ignored him entirely, had positioned herself opposite him, and had added her strength to his. Together, they had lifted the beam just enough for Wilson to drag himself free. The structure had chosen that moment to make its final protest. Diana had heard the crack, had seen Owen's eyes widen, had felt his hand close on her arm with bruising force as he pulled her forward and down, covering her body with his own as timbers rained around them. In the darkness and terror of that moment, pressed against Owen with his heart pounding against her back and his breath harsh in her ear, Diana had understood with perfect clarity that she would rather die here with him than live a lifetime without him. The collapse had been partial rather than complete. A timber had caught on a crossbeam, creating a small, protected space where they lay. Owen had remained covering her for a long moment after the dust had settled, his weight pressing her into the debris-covered floor. Then he had shifted, had asked roughly if she was injured, had helped her to her hands and knees when she indicated she was not. They had crawled forward together, Wilson ahead of them, following the shouts of the rescue party that was frantically digging toward them from the outside. When they had finally emerged into gray daylight and rain, Diana had been shaking with reaction, her gray dress ruined beyond redemption, her hands bleeding, her hair loose and filthy with plaster dust. Owen had looked little better. His elegant coat had been torn, his face was blackened with smoke, and there had been a cut above his left eye that bled sluggishly. He had stood in the rain, breathing heavily, staring at Diana with an expression that had combined anger, relief, and something else, something that had made her breath catch in her throat. Mr. Fairmont had arrived during the chaos, summoned from his study by the commotion. He had taken charge with unexpected competence, sending for physicians, arranging for the injured to be carried to proper quarters, praising the swift action that had prevented both deaths and the total destruction of the wing. Sarah had appeared as the immediate crisis was resolving, had rushed to Owen with flattering concern, and had insisted on personally tending his injuries. He had allowed himself to be led away toward the house, but had looked back once at Diana with an expression she could not read. Diana had refused the housekeeper's urgings to seek her own medical attention, had instead supervised the securing of the damaged area against weather and further collapse, had coordinated shelter for the workmen who had been displaced, had dealt with 100 practical necessities whilst moving in a state of strange detachment. It was only later, when she had finally retreated to her room and attempted to wash away the grime of the disaster, that she had permitted herself to feel Her hands had shaken so badly she could barely manage the buttons of her dress. She had sat on the edge of her narrow bed and had finally allowed herself to comprehend that Owen had covered her body with his own, had been prepared to die to shield her from falling debris, had cared enough about her survival to risk his own life. Yet he was courting Sarah. Yet he had told Sarah their past attachment was of no consequence. Yet he treated Diana with perfect formality as though she were merely a household employee and nothing more. Diana had rested her head in her hands and had acknowledged to herself that she could not continue like this. Something would have to give. Either Owen would formalize his understanding with Sarah and Diana would need to seek employment elsewhere, or she would disintegrate entirely from the stress of loving him whilst watching him build a life with someone else. The universe, it seemed, was preparing to force a resolution. The household had retired early that night, exhausted by the day's drama. The physicians had confirmed that all the injured would recover fully, though Wilson would require weeks of recuperation. The fire had been contained with minimal damage beyond the immediate collapse area. The storm had passed, leaving the air cool and fresh for the first time in weeks. Diana had been unable to sleep. She had lain in her narrow bed, watching moonlight paint patterns on her ceiling, replaying the moment when Owen had shielded her with his body, trying to understand what it meant. Near midnight, unable to bear her thoughts any longer, she had risen and dressed simply, then had descended to the library. Reading had often provided refuge when sleep would not come. She had entered the darkened room quietly, not wanting to wake the household, and had nearly startled into a shriek when a figure rose from one of the chairs by the empty fireplace. Owen. He had been sitting in the dark, she realized, probably unable to sleep for the same reasons that plagued her. He wore no coat, his shirt was open at the throat, and his hair was disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. He looked younger somehow, closer to the man she had known 8 years ago, and her heart had ached at the sight of him. They had stood in silence, the moonlight through the tall windows providing just enough light to see each other's faces. Diana had known she should apologize for disturbing him, should retreat immediately, should maintain the careful distance they had preserved for months. Instead, she had remained frozen, staring at him like a fool. Owen had spoken first, his voice rough and low. He had asked why she had followed him into the collapse. Had she taken complete leave of her senses? Did she understand she could have died? What possible explanation could she offer for such reckless behavior? The anger in his voice had been undercut by something that sounded suspiciously like anguish. Diana had struggled to find words, to construct some rational explanation for the irrational. She had finally settled on the truth, or at least a portion of it. Wilson had needed help. She had been capable of providing it. She had not paused to consider the risk. Owen had made a sound that might have been bitter laughter, had not paused to consider the risk. That, he had said with savage precision, summarized Diana Hartwell perfectly. She acted without thought, without consideration of consequences, and left others to deal with the aftermath. The accusation had struck home. Diana had felt color rise to her cheeks, even in the darkness. She had acknowledged the truth of his words with quiet dignity. She had indeed been thoughtless, had made choices that had damaged others, and she carried the consequences of those choices every day. Owen had been very still. Then he had asked, his voice carefully controlled, what choices she was referencing, what consequences she carried. Diana had hesitated, understanding that she stood at a precipice. She could deflect, could maintain the pretense that their past meant nothing, could let him marry Sarah and never know the truth of what she had sacrificed. Or she could be honest, could expose her heart to the contempt she undoubtedly deserved, could at least give him the explanation she should have offered 8 years ago. She had chosen honesty. The words had come haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as the dam of 8 years' silence had broken. She had told him about the debts, about the threats of scandal and prison, about Lady Margaret's relentless pressure, about believing she had no choice. She had confessed that she had lied when she had dismissed their attachment as meaningless, that she had been cruel because she had believed it would be kinder than the truth. She recalled the Herculean effort it had taken to keep her voice steady, the tremor in her hands that she had hidden in the folds of her gown, and the desperate hope that he would not see the devastating truth in her eyes. She had admitted that she had tried to go through with the marriage to Thornley and had failed, that her stubbornness had cost her family everything, that she had spent 8 years living with the knowledge that she had destroyed the only real thing she had ever possessed and had saved nothing in the bargain. Owen had listened without interruption, his face in shadow, his posture rigid. When she had finished, he had remained silent for a long moment. Then he had asked, his voice dangerous in its quietness, if she understood what she had done to him. Diana had whispered that she did, that she had known even then, that the knowledge had haunted her every day since. Owen had begun to pace, his movements sharp with barely contained emotion. He had gone to India because England had been unbearable, he had told her. He had thrown himself into his work with reckless intensity because it was the only thing that gave him purpose. He had built a fortune because he had nothing else to build, no one to build it for. He had returned to England because he had finally convinced himself that enough time had passed, that he had achieved enough, that he was ready to attempt a normal life. And then he had walked into the Fairmont drawing room and had seen her sitting there, still beautiful, still possessed of that quality that had captured him completely when he was 24. And he had understood that he had been lying to himself. Time had not healed anything. Success had not filled the void. He was as much in love with Diana Hartwell at 34 as he had been at 24, and the knowledge was a torture beyond description. Diana had been weeping openly by then, tears streaming down her face in the moonlight. She had tried to speak, but Owen had continued, his voice raw with pain and anger. Did she know that he had courted Sarah Fairmont, not because he admired her particularly, though she was admirable enough, but because she was young and wealthy and everything Diana had once told him she needed? Did she understand that he had been trying desperately to convince himself that he could build a life with someone else, that he could forget, that he could move forward? And did she comprehend how completely she had destroyed that illusion when she had followed him into a collapsing building with no thought for her own safety? He had stopped pacing then, had turned to face her directly. No woman courting a comfortable marriage would do such a thing, he had said. No woman who felt nothing would risk her life for workers she barely knew. So he needed Diana to tell him, with perfect honesty, what she had been thinking when she had followed him into that wreckage. Diana had been trembling violently. She had wrapped her arms around herself and had met his eyes in the moonlight. She had thought, she had told him with the last shreds of her courage that she would rather die with him than live without him. That if the structure collapsed and killed them both, at least she would not have to endure watching him marry Sarah. That she loved him still, had never stopped loving him, and that she understood she had forfeited any right to his regard, but could not, would not, lie about her feelings anymore. The silence after her confession had been absolute. Diana had watched Owen's face, had seen shock, disbelief, and something that might have been desperate hope chase across his features. Then he had closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and had pulled her into his arms with a roughness born of long denial. He had held her tightly enough to hurt, his face buried in her hair, his breath coming in shuddering gasps. Diana had clung to him, her hands fisted in his shirt, 8 years of loneliness and regret pouring out in silent tears. They had stood like that for a long time, simply holding each other, saying nothing because words seemed inadequate to the enormity of what they were feeling. When Owen had finally pulled back enough to see her face, his own had been wet with tears. He had cupped her face in his hands and had asked, his voice breaking, if she understood what she was saying. If she comprehended that he would not, could not, survive losing her again. That if she was offering him hope only to snatch it away, it would destroy him completely. Diana had covered his hands with her own and had sworn to him that she meant every word. that she had been a foolish girl who had made a terrible choice out of fear, but that she was a woman now who understood the value of what she had lost, that she knew she had no right to ask for his forgiveness, much less his love, but that she would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve both if he would give her the chance. Owen had made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. He had kissed her then, not with the tentative gentleness of their youth, but with the desperate passion of two people who had wandered lost for years and had finally found their way home. Diana had kissed him back with equal fervor, uncaring that it was improper, that they could be discovered, that she was ruining both their reputations. Nothing mattered except the solid reality of Owen in her arms, his heart beating against hers, his breath mingling with hers. When they had finally broken apart, both breathless, Owen had rested his forehead against hers and had told her that he had never stopped loving her, that he had tried but had failed utterly, that she had owned his heart since that first conversation about architecture in a Bath ballroom and would own it until he died. Diana had laughed and wept simultaneously, joy and relief flooding through her with such intensity that she had felt lightheaded. She had started to speak, to tell him everything she felt, but he had silenced her with another kiss, this one tender and sweet and full of promise. Eventually, they had settled together on the sofa near the window, unwilling to part even for the width of the room. Owen had kept Diana's hand clasped in his thumb tracing patterns on her palm, as though reassuring himself of her reality. They had talked in hushed voices, filling in the gaps of 8 years, confessing fears and dreams, making plans that seemed impossible but felt inevitable. Owen had told her that he would speak to Mr. Fairmont in the morning, would explain that he could not, in good conscience, continue to court Sarah when his heart belonged irrevocably elsewhere. He anticipated that it would cost him the Fairmont Commission and possibly other work, as offending a family of their standing often led to broader social consequences. But he found he did not care. He had spent 8 years building a fortune to prove himself worthy, and if he lost every penny of it to claim Diana, he would consider it a bargain well made. Diana had protested that she would not allow him to sacrifice his professional reputation for her. But Owen had been firm. He had already made one devastating error by allowing her to slip away 8 years ago. He would not compound it by prioritizing social standing or professional success over their happiness. If necessary, they would leave England entirely, would start fresh somewhere else, would build a life together on their own terms. They had remained in the library until dawn threatened, reluctant to end the conversation, to break the spell of finally, after so many years, being together without barriers. When pale light had begun to streak the eastern sky, Owen had kissed Diana one last time, long and deep, then had reluctantly released her. They had agreed to speak again after he had conversation with Mr. Fairmont, had parted with whispered endearments that felt both strange and utterly natural after so long. Diana had floated through her morning duties in a state of dazed happiness, unable to fully believe that the impossible had occurred. Owen loved her still. Owen wanted her still. Owen was willing to risk everything for her. The knowledge was almost too much to contain, a joy so profound it felt nearly painful in its intensity. Owen had called upon Mr. Fairmont before noon, requesting a private interview in that gentleman's study. Diana had not been present, but she had learned the details later from Owen himself. He had been direct and honest, had explained that he had been previously acquainted with Miss Diana Hartwell, that they had shared an attachment years ago, and that attachment had never truly ended on his part. He had therefore found it necessary to withdraw from his implicit courtship of Miss Sarah Fairmont, as it would be unconscionable to continue when his heart was engaged elsewhere. Mr. Fairmont had been surprisingly understanding. He had appreciated Owen's honesty, had noted that Sarah, while flattered by Owen's attentions, had never seemed deeply attached to him. Indeed, Mr. Fairmont had suspected his daughter's heart was elsewhere, though she had not yet confided in him. As for the renovation, Mr. Fairmont was too well pleased with the quality of the work to terminate the commission over personal matters. Owen would complete the project as agreed, and they would part as gentlemen. Sarah herself had taken the news with remarkable grace when her father explained the situation. She had confessed, with becoming embarrassment, that she had indeed been nurturing an attachment to a younger son of Lord Marchwood, but had been pursuing Owen because her mother had been so determined on the match. She was, she admitted with surprising self-awareness, relieved to be released from a courtship that had been more flattering than emotionally engaging. Mrs. Fairmont, upon her return from Kent several days later, had been considerably less sanguine. She had been displeased to discover that her plans for Sarah had been disrupted, and even more displeased to learn that her paid companion was at the center of the disruption. Mr. Fairmont had been firm in Diana's defense, but Mrs. Fairmont possessed both influence and vindictiveness in equal measure. Within a fortnight, Owen had lost a significant commission to design a country house for the Earl of Denbury. The Earl's wife, a particular friend of Mrs. Fairmont, had made it quietly known that Mr. Garrett's professional judgment was questionable if he could not distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate romantic attachments. The whispers spread through drawing rooms with the efficiency that only malicious gossip achieved. Diana, meanwhile, found herself subjected to deliberate cuts when she accompanied the Fairmonts on morning calls. Lady Castleton, one of the patronesses of Almack's, and a woman whose approval could make or break a young lady's season, had looked directly through Diana at a musicale as though she were invisible. The message was clear. Those who disrupted the social order, who overstepped the boundaries of their position, would be reminded precisely where they belonged. Yet neither Owen nor Diana had wavered. If anything, the opposition had strengthened their resolve. They had endured 8 years of separation. They would not surrender to a few months of social disapproval. Owen had proposed to Diana formally that same evening in the newly renovated drawing room that showcased his talents so admirably. He had no ring yet, he admitted, as he had been carrying Sarah's ring in his pocket with a sense of dutiful resignation when he had realized he could not possibly offer it to her. But he had his heart, his fortune, his name, and a profound desire to spend the rest of his life making Diana happy, and he hoped that would suffice. Diana had accepted with tears streaming down her face, had told him that she needed nothing but him, that she had lived 8 years in the gray twilight of loss and refused to waste another moment. They would marry as soon as the banns could be read, would marry with or without society's approval, would build a life together based on the foundation of faith they should have maintained from the beginning. The wedding had taken place 6 weeks later in a small church in Cheapside, far from the fashionable venues where the Tun celebrated their unions. Diana had worn a simple gown of cream silk, had carried roses from the Fairmont garden, Sarah had insisted, with genuine warmth, and had been attended by the housekeeper who had served her faithfully for 8 years. Owen had stood at the altar with an expression of such profound joy that several attendees had wept. When the vicar had pronounced them man and wife, Owen had kissed Diana with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of devotion, and she had felt the last heavy chains of regret fall away. They had honeymooned in the Lake District in a cottage Owen had designed as a personal retreat years ago. There, surrounded by dramatic landscapes and far from society's watchful eyes, they had rediscovered each other with the patience and passion of people who understood exactly how precious their second chance was. Owen had told Diana about his years in India, about the loneliness that had driven him to work with obsessive dedication, about the night he had received word that her marriage to Thornley had been cancelled, and had spent hours trying to decide if he should return to England and attempt to see her. He had ultimately decided against it, convinced that she would not welcome his renewed attention after the cruelty with which she had dismissed him. Diana had confessed the full depth of her regret, had told him about the years of wishing she could go back and choose differently, about seeing young couples in love and feeling that hollow ache of knowing she had traded her chance at such happiness for security that had proved illusory. She had told him about the night she had learned he had returned to London, had admitted that she had spent hours weeping for the girl she had been and the choice she had made. They had also discussed the future with practical honesty. Owen's professional reputation had survived the scandal with minimal damage. His work spoke for itself, and the Tun was surprisingly willing to overlook personal irregularities in someone who could provide them with beautiful houses. Diana had resigned from the Fairmont service with their blessing. Mr. Fairmont had settled a generous sum upon her as gratitude for her years of faithful service and her courage during the collapse. Together, they had established a household that reflected both their personalities, elegant but comfortable, filled with books and architectural drawings, open to a carefully selected circle of friends who valued substance over social position. Owen continued to design buildings that garnered increasing acclaim, and Diana became his partner in truth, managing the business aspects of his commissions with the same efficiency she had once applied to household management. In the autumn of their first year of marriage, Diana discovered she was carrying their child. Owen had wept when she told him, had knelt before her and pressed his face to her still flat stomach, and thanked Providence for giving them not only a second chance, but also the opportunity to create the family they had dreamed of as young lovers. The child, a daughter with her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, was born the following spring. They named her Margaret, after the aunt whose well-intentioned cruelty had set in motion Diana's 8 years of suffering, but they chose the name without bitterness. Lady Margaret had acted from fear and a misguided sense of duty. She could not have known that her niece would survive and ultimately triumph, despite rather than because of her intervention. As their daughter grew, Diana would sometimes watch Owen teaching the child to sketch, his patient hands guiding her small fingers, and would feel a gratitude so profound it made her breathless. She had been given a gift she had not deserved, a second chance to choose wisely, to claim love over security, to build a life based on faith rather than fear. Owen would catch her watching, would smile at her with eyes full of love, and would remind her that they had both been young and foolish once, that mistakes were the price of growing into wisdom, that what mattered was not the years they had lost, but the life they were building together. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Owen presented Diana with a gift, a complete set of architectural drawings for a house he was designing for them. It would be built on property they had purchased in Surrey, a gracious estate with grounds extensive enough for their growing family and close enough to London for Owen's professional needs. The design was magnificent, incorporating everything they loved: a library with floor-to-ceiling windows, a drawing room with perfect proportions, a nursery suite designed to accommodate the siblings they hoped their daughter would have, and a private study for Diana where she could manage Owen's business affairs in comfort. But the most remarkable feature was a small conservatory off the main drawing room, filled with roses and designed to catch the morning light. Owen had labeled it on the drawings Diana's Garden, and had told her that it was where he imagined her spending her mornings, peaceful and content, in the home they had built together on a foundation of hard-won wisdom and enduring love. As Diana studied the drawings, tracing the elegant lines with fingers that no longer bore traces of plaster dust and splinters, she had reflected on the strange paths life could take. She had chosen wrong at 20, had spent 8 years paying for that choice, and had been granted a miraculous opportunity to choose again at 8 and 20. She had nearly failed to seize that opportunity, had been too crippled by shame and regret to claim what her heart had always known it needed. But love, as she had learned, possessed a persistence that defied logic. It waded through years of separation. It survived cruelty and misunderstanding. It created second chances where none seemed possible. And when finally given the opportunity to flourish, it transformed two people who had been wandering lost into partners who could build something beautiful together. The house in Surrey was completed 2 years later. On the day they took residence, Owen carried Diana across the threshold with the same care he had shown on their wedding day, then set her down in the entrance hall and gestured to the home he had created for her. This, he told her, was what he had dreamed of building since he was 24 years old. Not just a house of brick and timber, but a home filled with love, laughter, and the absolute certainty that they had chosen rightly at last. Every line of the structure reflected his devotion. Every carefully considered detail spoke of his desire to give her the beauty and security she deserved. Diana had looked around at the elegant proportions, the perfect balance of light and space, the subtle touches that made the house uniquely theirs, and had understood that Owen had given her something far more precious than any fortune could buy. He had given her faith, in love, in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, and in the transformative power of choosing courageously when courage was most needed. They stood together in the entrance hall of their new home, surrounded by evidence of Owen's talents and their shared dreams, and Diana whispered her gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Owen kissed her softly and responded that he was grateful too, grateful for the years of separation that had taught them both the value of what they shared, grateful for the pain that had refined them into people capable of building something enduring, grateful for the second chance they had seized with both hands. Their daughter came running then, exploring the new house with delighted squeals, and they followed her into their future with hearts full of joy and gratitude. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, had been transformed into the foundation upon which they built their happiness. For Diana finally understood in her soul that the true security she had always sought was not found in an estate or a title, but in the arms of the man who had built a home within her heart. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even across years of separation and regret, even when all seems lost beyond redemption. Miss Diana Hartwell and Mr. Owen Garrett learned what many discover only through suffering, that the heart's truest choices require not merely passion, but also courage, faith, and the willingness to risk everything for what matters most. Their story serves as a reminder that second chances, when they come, must be seized with both hands, for Providence rarely offers a third opportunity to those who squander the first two.